Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. My name is Amber Elias, and joining me for this News Focus episode is FlightGlobal's Defense Managing Editor, Greg Waldron. Greg, welcome to this episode.
Great to join you, Amber.
Let's take a look at the top aviation stories this week on FlightGlobal. The Department of Transportation has cancelled the operating authorities for AirTran, Continental, US Airways, and Virgin America. All four carriers have long since been acquired by other US airlines and had ceased flying passengers. It is unclear why the DOT allowed those airlines' interstate authorities to remain active for so long after they ceased operating. Russian President Vladimir Putin is urging prompt development and serial production of the proposed PD-26 engine, which has potential application to a range of large aircraft programs. Russian carrier United Aircraft recently detailed a proposed family of airliners, similar to the Boeing 787, which could be powered by the PD-26. Finally, the Boeing MQ-28 Ghost-Bat collaborative combat aircraft has made its public flying debut with a demonstration at Australia's Woomera Test Range. Greg, you were just in Australia for the event and saw the Ghost-Bat take flight. What can you tell us about the launch in the aircraft?
Well, Amber, this is definitely one of the more interesting events I've attended in my time at FlightGlobal. Myself and a few other journalists, as well as some Boeing people, some Air Force people, and some Ministry of Defense people, rode a C-27J tactical transport to this secret weapons testing range at Woomera, which is kind of up in south central Australia. Quite a long flight, 3 hours in the back of a transport, but it was well worth it because the MQ-28 has been flying since 2021. It's appeared on static at Avalon, but this is the first time the media really got to witness it, and it was very high profile. The RAAF chief was on the trip, the Minister of Defense Industry, as well as some very senior Boeing people.
So this aircraft was co-developed by Boeing Defence Australia and the Royal Australian Air Force, and it completed key milestones 4 months ahead of schedule. How does a project like this come about and take shape?
Well, this is certainly more of an unusual one. The 2019 Avalon Air Show, which it seems like a long time ago, but it's only 6 years. Boeing had a special stand out in the middle of the paddock there, and nobody's allowed to look in and so forth. And then they had an event, so we're all curious as to what it's going to be. And what it turned out is they had a life-size mock-up of the aircraft, which was then called the Air Power Teaming System, inside a pavilion there. And of course, this was the big news of the Avalon 2019 show. So the Ghost-Bat is designed to be one of these new collaborative combat aircraft. It's designed to be far cheaper than an existing fighter. I think Boeing has said it should be about 10% of the price of a manned aircraft. So it's a relatively inexpensive aircraft. It doesn't have a pilot. It has a very basic engine. And the idea is that you want to use this aircraft to cooperate with your existing aircraft. In the Australian case, this would be, F-18s, which are made by Boeing, as well as the F-35s, which are made by Lockheed. And the Ghost-Bat is designed to complement these manned fighters. And it's envisaged as having, different, you can change the nose on the aircraft. So some noses could be electronic warfare. Another nose could be like an infrared sensor. Another nose could be an actual search radar, that kind of thing. So really the idea is to give the Air Force a lot of flexibility. So Boeing went ahead and built some prototypes. The first flight was in 2021. They've built 8 prototypes in the Block 1 of configuration of this aircraft. And so far they've amassed 150 hours of flight time and, tens of thousands of hours of simulated time as well, which is really helpful. So they're producing 3 Block 2 prototypes and a follow-on, and these are going to be much more robust aircraft than the early Block 1 examples. These are going to be used for more exhaustive testing. And if everything goes well with these Block 2 aircraft, you could see the Block 3 MQ-28 perhaps enter service with the Royal Australian Air Force within the next few years. And the Block 3 will be much more of what we might consider a standard combat aircraft. It'll have, the interchangeable sensors on the nose, but it'll also have weapons bays so it can fire air-to-air missiles or drop bombs. And it'll just be a much more robust capability. And the idea would be that it's so cheap that Australia can buy a bunch of them to help complement their existing fighter force.
So how do you see the RAAF utilizing this type of aircraft? Is it going to fit in with existing sort of planes, models, and fighters, or is it replacing aircraft that already exist or maybe are aging out of the system?
Yeah, certainly, Amber. I had a really interesting discussion with the head of the Australian Air Force, Stephen Chappell, last week, at the event. And he was telling me that it's not really designed to replace manned fighters, but really serve as a complement to, manned assets. The idea is that it's going to perform a, range of missions like, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, weapons, defensive counter-air. The Australian Air Force is relatively small given the massive size of Australia. And Air Chief Chappell, when I was speaking to him, he painted this picture of, you'll have all of these ghost bats deployed along, say, the northern coast of Australia. And these things, the range of the ghost bat's quite good. It's about 2,000 nautical miles, which is considerably better than an F-35 or an F-18. And the idea would be is that you put your ghost bats up, they have the radar, they have the sensors, and they kind of keep an eye out for incoming threats. I mean, they're really up there, they're highly automated. You could have one guy sitting in a control station controlling 20 of these things. And these would be, kind of up in the air. And this means that if, they're expecting a threat, that your manned pilots can sort of sit back. You don't have to have all these, manned fighters on Ready Alert 5 or Ready Alert 30 waiting to take off, which can be very exhausting and very tiring. That's kind of what it's envisaged as. It's envisaged as really adding mass to the Air Force. The Air Chief told me that it would take the small Australian Air Force and make it into a medium-sized Air Force. And to this end, they're going to be firing an air-to-air missile from the aircraft later this year. So that's something that they're working on right now.
Yeah, to go from a small-size Air Force to a medium-size simply through aircraft acquisition seems pretty impressive. Are there personnel that are required to operate these? I know they're uncrewed, but presumably they'll have to increase the number of personnel that they have within the Air Force as well. Or is it simply through just aircraft acquisition alone?
Well, that's actually a very good point, Amber. The Australian Air Force is really looking at how they're going to employ these Air Force because you're going to be bringing in all these new aircraft. Now, of course, you will not need pilots, but you'll need people to, maintain these aircraft. You still will need operators, even though the aircraft is highly automatic when it's in the air and can perform missions with a great deal of autonomy. You'll still need operators on the ground. And also, too, it can be operated as a loyal wingman from other aircraft. So they did some work where 2 ghost bats were controlled by an Australian E-7 airborne early warning and control aircraft. So the idea is that, you will have people actually interacting with it. Either it's on the ground or in the air and so forth. And for the Australians, and I think other air forces that are contemplating, these unmanned aircraft, how do you actually integrate them in your force? Do you assign them to your existing squadrons? Like for every fighter you have, every F-18 or every F-35, you give 2 Ghost Bat collaborative combat aircraft to those guys. Or do you start out, you have a dedicated, MQ-28 Ghost Bat squadron. You really use that to develop the concepts of use to really figure out what personnel need to do. And then later, maybe you add that to your existing squadrons. That's really the crux of it. How do you fit this in the organization? But I think one thing that Air Forces want to do with these types of aircraft, which I must stress are far more simple aircraft than the existing fighters that most Air Forces currently use. But I think one thing that these systems do, even though they will have a manpower requirement, the idea is that they're going to be making the Air Force more efficient. So for every set number of personnel, you'll have more aircraft actually out there that can be deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. Last week, I was speaking with our colleague, Ryan Finnerty, who's FlightGlobal's America's defense reporter, about the collaborative combat aircraft prototype from General Atomics Aeronautical Systems. How does a Ghost Bat compare? Because that is also very close to being actually in service.
Yeah, so the U.S. is looking at 2 aircraft right now, one from Anduril and one from General Atomics. And, that's going to be the next iteration of the collaborative combat aircraft in the U.S. Now, As far as we know, the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, despite being a product with a lot of Boeing investment, isn't set for any requirements in the USA that we know about. But generally, this is in the same competitive arena. But I'd add, though, that it has some other objective as well. From the Australian perspective, especially from the Australian government perspective, it's really about developing your local production base and defense base. So it's about providing, local jobs, about generating a bit more autonomy for the Australian Defence Force. In case there's a conflict, they'll be able to have, local aircraft production. The Ghost Bat has a large number of Australian suppliers. There's a lot of Australian people who will work on it. If they do decide to go to contract with this, it'll be mainly an Australian program. They also have ambitions to sell it overseas. So at the Paris Air Show, they were talking about potential partnerships in Europe for the aircraft because other air forces will need this type of aircraft. That's the thing. And also I might add too, that the Ghost Bat is highly compatible or totally compatible with the U.S. military. The U.S. Air Force Research Lab has actual personnel based at Woomera working on the Ghost Bat. And the idea is that the Ghost Bat can be compatible with the Royal Australian Air Force, but if they send some Ghost Bats to, wherever the U.S. might be, or U.S. forces might be, these aircraft will be able to plug and play with U.S. and allied forces. Interoperability has always been a major concern for the U.S. and, of course, for its allies in the region. So the Ghost Bat, even if the U.S. doesn't say buy it, the aircraft still will be very much capable of cooperating with the U.S. and allied forces.
So it seems like this type of aircraft is really shaping up to be the future of a lot of air forces. We're looking at uncrewed aircraft, interchangeability, a lot of compatibility between allies and air force fleets globally. We know that China are also developing a number of prototypes, but when can we actually expect to see this type of uncrewed aircraft in service? And are more traditional fighters still in development as well?
Okay, well, I'll take the first question first about when things like collaborative combat aircraft will be in service. Certainly the progress being made in the U.S. as well as, with the Ghost Bat program suggests that, before the end of the decade, you'll definitely see these things start entering service with air forces. Now, that means that, the air forces will get their hands on them. They'll start working with operational squadrons. And since it's such a new technology, they'll really have to kind of figure out how are the best ways to use them? There are a number of concepts of operation, but I think the air forces will need to determine that. So I would say that before the end of the decade, you'll start seeing these CCAs, deployed to air forces. And then I think, the 20s, 30s, and 2040s, also in line with developments with artificial intelligence, so forth. That's when you're really going to start to see them coming into their own. That's when they're going to be really becoming a much more critical part of the force. And so that's certainly, I think these types of systems have a very bright future, but there still is some way to go before they're that integral, fundamental part of world air forces. Regarding, manned aircraft, certainly I think there's going to be a major role for very advanced Generation 6 manned platforms. And these Generation 6 manned platforms, you've got the F-47 in the USA, potentially a new naval fighter in the USA. You've got the GCAP program, which is Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. You've got the FCAS program in Europe, which, the partners seem to be arguing quite a bit about work share. But these are going to be very highly evolved, stealthy aircraft that have amazing sensors, amazing weapons, amazing capabilities, and they're manned. But these things are going to be vastly more expensive than, the CCAs, to the order of 10, 20 times more expensive. But what you'll be seeing is that you'll have this fleet of CCAs, and the manned fighters, such as F-47, will be really kind of coordinating, flights of these aircraft. So the pilot of the F-47 will be able to ask, he has two MQ-28s, and he says, hey, you two, there's some contact over there. I want you to go check it out. And you have permission to engage if it turns out to be hostile. And he just would assign that. And then the MQ-28s would fly off. And then the F-47 would be able to monitor other things as well. So that's kind of the way things are evolving. So, the future 15, 20 years, you could see small numbers of very advanced manned fighters and large numbers of these collaborative combat aircraft.
Absolutely. It does seem like they are being designed to work in harmony and not a one-for-one replacement, which I think is something to consider, when we're talking about Australia increasing their fleet size quite substantially, is actually through a product that is not disposable necessarily, but is cheaper to produce and has a different utility within the Air Force.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one thing I'd say about, the MQ-28, I saw it taxiing by at the runway, and it's very kind of eerie seeing this very sleek fighter type aircraft. Just kind of has a real sense of purpose about it as it, kind of goes out to the runway, very unflinching, of course. But, that has a very basic engine. It's a Williams FJ44 engine. So it's compared to a fighter like an F-35 or an F-18, it's very underpowered. It can only perform 4G, which is far below what you can perform in typical man fighters. And of course, it's supposed to be just a tenth of the cost. So these things aren't necessarily disposable. I mean, $15-20 million is still a lot of money, and you just don't throw it away like peanuts. But still, for air forces that really need to build up their combat mass, which is kind of one of the buzzwords these days, this type of lower cost unmanned system is, really going to be a viable candidate for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It does feel like we're going to be seeing a few more of these, at least in prototype stage, around in the next couple of years as other countries sort of advance their programs as well. Even though the Ghost Bat is actually, as you said, for sale for other countries as well, and even in the US. And same with the aircraft that the US are developing. Each Ghost Bat itself would have specifications aligned to that country, and that country's Air Force. But ultimately, this does feel like a slightly new way of doing aircraft. It's not as bespoke each time. And that's obviously to do with the cost, but also how modular the aircraft is itself. As you were saying, that you can change the nose, you can change the capabilities, you can change the utility of the Ghost Bat itself. And it's just fascinating to see this kind of slightly different style of aircraft entering the conversation in a mass way over the next, 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah, certainly. And I think a great emphasis on, certainly on the MQ-28, but also on the other collaborative combat aircraft is they've really emphasized, the production system to really, try to keep those costs down. I think also there's an effort to really focus on not letting capabilities creep into the system. One of the banes of, many a military aircraft in history has been they start out with something fairly straightforward, but then they keep adding and adding capabilities. And of course, this kind of keep escalating the price. So I think it's key for, air forces to be very clear about the specific missions that they want these collaborative combat aircraft to perform. And then, of course, for industry to really provide the low-cost production options to make sure that these things can be brought to bear in significant mass.
Absolutely. We're sort of looking at like a base model of perhaps like, a really standard car. And then when it's tailored to each Air Force, they're adding on specific capabilities, but working on an actual, just the lowest grade prototype and then having that in production and then advancing it onwards feels like the quickest way to get this type of product into the market.
Yeah, and I might also stress, too, that, traditionally with aircraft, there's been a lot of physical work that needs to take place if you're going to make modifications so it can do, different missions. But the MQ-28, Boeing stresses this quite a bit. Like the software architecture is really key, as it is with the other CCAs. And the idea is that you have this software that can be really quickly updated. So if you want to change the mission to electronic warfare, that's a software thing. If you want to change the mission to some other type of work like anti-surface warfare, like fighting ships, again, that's a software thing. So the idea is not that you have to constantly keep modifying and changing the aircraft, but you have this basic airframe. The software is really the secret sauce that makes it work. I mean, one of the Boeing guys even told me earlier this year about MQ-28, he says, look, don't focus so much on the airplane. Focus on the autonomy. Focus on what's really driving this. Because once you've actually got that autonomous engine, that capability, you could really drop that into, any aircraft, really. And that's kind of an interesting way of look at it. Whereas I think as, certainly as defense journalists and, I guess the public too, you really kind of focus on the plane. But there's a lot more going on here. And a lot of it's actually the computer brain of these aircraft that is really the secret sauce that makes them work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I see pictures of the Ghost Spout, which listeners can do on FlightGlobal.com, we'll link to the articles in the show notes. But when I see pictures of the Ghost Spout, I do immediately look at the physical plane. I'm looking at the aircraft. I'm looking at the design of it, looking at the physical capabilities that I can see on it. I'm not really looking at it as an advanced flying computer in total layman's terms. And I think, as you were saying that, I think actually the computer is what makes this aircraft important and vital and special and a step forward in development. And it's actually less about the physical design and more about how, the computer can be, once it's up and running, it's totally remote and can be used in other aircraft potentially in the future as well. So that's definitely something that we should be keeping in mind when we see more of these sort of uncrewed aircraft types coming into the market.
Yeah, definitely. But I will add, though, that CCAs do have to have just enough capability as physical aircraft to really collaborate with something like a Gen 6 aircraft or an F-35. Because, they do need to have a degree of survivability in these highly contested environments. So if you look at the Ghost Spout, even though it lacks a pilot, it is kind of shaped. So, it is stealthy, obviously to reduce its radar cross section. And there will be probably some secret stuff that happens, whether, coatings or the way they structure, the engine intakes and that kind of thing that are really designed to make it a low observable aircraft. The other thing that's really critical about Ghost Spout, as well as these other aircraft, is, again, it's not just about the specific aircraft, but it's really about, how it collaborates with the broader force. It's really about the data links and how they talk to each other. So when I was at Woomera, the two aircraft took off, they were sent to an area nearby, and they were scanning that area, and they were talking to each other, kind of performing a mission all on their own, right? And so the idea that they can talk with each other as well as talk with manned platforms is key, because that's how, you develop a kill chain. That's how everybody, collaborates together. So you could have a MQ-28 using its radar in a combat situation, and the manned assets can remain silent. And that way the MQ-28 is kind of doing a job that's, somewhat more dangerous. So really the key about these things too is not just getting them up in the air, but how they actually can work together, how they can work together with manned aircraft. So that communications element is critical.
No, it does absolutely feel like this type of uncrewed aircraft are what we're going to see more of as air forces look to increase their combat mass in a sustainable way and in a reliable way over time. Greg, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of FlightGlobal Focus.
Thank you, Amber. Been great to chat with you.
FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.